Joining us now from New York is Josh Lockman. He's an expert in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. He's a professor at the University of Southern California. Thanks so much for joining us. Josh, we've seen this drill before, U.S. presidents in their second terms thinking about their legacy, trying to revive Middle East peace talks. Clinton did it with the 2000 Camp David summit. That came up short. George W. Bush's Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice tried to broker a deal before he left the White House. Again, it came up short. What's different this time around?
Well, I think what's different this time, Mike, this is, like you said, this elusive quest to create a Palestinian state and create the conditions really for a wider Arab-Israeli accord. I think what's different this time is the energy we're seeing that Secretary Kerry is putting into this. He has single-handedly brought the Israelis and Palestinians together over the last few months and laid the groundwork for what will be, I think, successful talks initially to try to bridge the gap between the two sides, primarily on territorial concessions. And I think they're trying to obviously lower expectations. We just heard, the Israeli and Palestinian sides do not want to raise expectations that a deal is imminent at all. But I think laying the groundwork for at least a deal on territorial concessions and what the border will look like for the future Palestinian state would be a huge victory for the United States here.
Josh, you brought up John Kerry. He brought along Indyk today, pointed out that he's part of all of this. He was part of the 2000 Camp David summit. Does that background help in the sense that he was there before and saw this thing kind of fall apart? Does that give him added ammunition, so to speak?
I think it does. Martin Indyk is a veteran diplomat. He is a savvy negotiator and knows both sides very well and has great rapport with both the Israeli and Palestinian sides. And that's critical, especially because the Palestinian side obviously felt that the United States was no longer an honest broker in mediating this conflict. We saw this in the wake of the bid for statehood at the UN and pressure by the United States, obviously, against that. I think at this point, what these talks and the resumption of direct talks brokered by the United States shows is that the U.S. still remains the single most important player in resolving not only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Mike, but the Arab-Israeli conflict and bringing other Arab states on board, particularly Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, and others that are regional actors that can weigh in both with Fatah on the West Bank and also kind of the 800-pound gorilla here, Hamas in Gaza, and that will be critical.
Josh, let's talk about Israel's neighbors. There's so much unrest in Syria, civil war going on there. Egypt, there's been a great deal of chaos. Does that give Israel more of an impetus to reach an agreement this time around, do you think, or does that have any bearing at all?
It's an excellent question. Many looked at Israel over the last 2 years and thought this is an island of stability amidst really a turbulent and chaotic Middle East landscape. Israel has largely been spared, much of the ire that's been directed toward it over the last, 6 decades in its history by neighboring Arab states as they focused, obviously, on building organic movements for democracy in their own countries. That being said, I think there's a concern within Israel that once the dust settles, once the Arab Spring takes more shape, and this is obviously a long process, more attention will be paid to the fact that there is no Palestinian state still, and that is a huge thorn in Israel's side, particularly as it tries to build relationships with key Arab states in the region, which will undoubtedly bring many benefits to both sides. Namely the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, even Saudi Arabia. So I think Israel is looking to the long-term future and trying to essentially be a part of its neighborhood, which has long been denied. And the key to that is obviously creating the conditions for a Palestinian state.
Josh, I think we have time for one last question. Anytime you have something like this that festers for a long period of time, there's deep suspicion, there's also growing animosity. What needs to happen for these two sides to really sit down and reach a deal?
Well, I think what we saw, obviously, in Camp David in 2000 and even in 2008 between former Israeli Prime Minister Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority is that the sides are so close to a deal. We're really talking about the core issues of territory, security, Jerusalem, and refugees. And these sides, the gap is very narrow. It just comes down to domestic political will and, like you said, the element of trust. And that's really where the United States has to come in and essentially build that trust back and guarantee to both sides, almost similar to what the U.S. did between Egypt and Israel, that the U.S., along with key Arab states, will monitor this agreement and will lay the conditions that the most sensitive issues especially Jerusalem, will be monitored internationally and will be essentially secure for both sides. And I think that's the key part that the United States plays here and reasserts its role as the primary mediator in this conflict.
Josh Lockman sounding an optimistic note this evening. Thanks so much for joining us from New York.